In 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa, technologically one of the most powerful vessels of her time, tragically sank on her maiden voyage. As the best preserved 17th century shipwreck in the world, the Vasa is not just a ship, she is a time capsule. Studying her has yielded invaluable insights into shipbuilding techniques, naval warfare, and daily life in the 17th century. The reasons behind the Vasa's unexpected sinking are surrounded by speculation and common misconception. This is her fascinating story.
What you see behind me is a unique survival from the early 17th century. This is a warship over 50 meters long, built in 1626, 1627. It sank during its maiden voyage, but then was raised nearly intact 333 years later. We're looking at a little bit more than 98% original material from almost 400 years ago. In the first part of the 17th century, Sweden was a geographically large but underpopulated country. It included most of what's now Sweden, all of what's now Finland, and parts of the Baltic countries and even a little bit of Russia. The King of Sweden in the early part of the 17th century, especially Gustav II Adolf, believed that Sweden ought to be a major player in the power politics. They also saw that they believed that Sweden was surrounded by its enemies. Gustav Adolf, as part of this vision, reorganized the state to try to focus the resources that existed within Sweden onto the sole task of building a competitive military. First starting with the army, and then eventually the navy, and in the case of the navy, new kinds of ships. The king, however, believed that the future of naval warfare was going to be artillery duels between heavily armed gun platforms. And so in his rebuilding of the Navy in the 1620s, he started ordering a new kind of ship to be built. The first of those ships to be built was Vasa. Vasa's keel was laid in February or March of 1626 and took about a year and a half to build, but waited a year to get its armament on board. Vasa was built using a method of shipbuilding that had been around since at least Roman times. And this was a method of designing and building ships that did not require any paper. There were no drawings. And this worked very well for the shipbuilders, but it had the problem that it was very difficult to administer. After many delays trying to complete the armament of the ship, it finally set sail on the afternoon of the 10th of August, 1628. The ship only sailed about 1,200 meters from the city heading east down the harbor. And as it got to a gap in the southern highland, the wind gets funneled out into the harbor at that spot, and it filled the sails and heeled the ship so far over that the lower gun ports were in the water until it filled and sank. Most of the people who were on board survived. The ship was only about 120 meters from shore. If you could swim, you just swam ashore. If you couldn't swim, the upper parts of the masts were still out of the water. So you could cling on to something until a boat picked you up. When the ship was excavated, there were the skeletons of 15 people found inside the ship. There were a lot of questions immediately about what had happened. There was a lot of finger pointing, of course. Nobody wanted to take the blame, but it emerged that they had a pretty good understanding of what had happened and why the ship had sunk. The first and most obvious is the ship is a bad ship. It's a bad design to start out with. And there's way too much ship above the waterline compared to the amount of ship carrying that weight below the water. However, that just means the ship was unstable. If it had not gone to sea, it wouldn't have sunk. Somebody ordered it to sea. About a month before the ship sailed, the captain who was supervising construction dragged the vice admiral in charge of procurement and had him watch while he ordered 30 sailors to run back and forth across the upper deck to show the admiral that the ship wasn't stable. The admiral ordered that demonstration stopped because he was afraid the ship would roll over right there at the pier. And he appointed the captain who had demonstrated that the ship was unstable to be the ship's captain. And he sailed it very, very carefully. But he made one key error. Because he had to show off the guns and fire a salute, there was a way for water to come into the ship. The king probably has a little bit of responsibility. He was the one who created that decision-making environment. The admiral didn't want to disappoint him, didn't want to tell them that the ship was unstable and couldn't get to its station. Nowadays, it's a popular belief that the reason the ship is unstable is because the king meddled in the construction. He ordered them to add another gun deck, or he ordered them to make the ship longer. But in fact, there's absolutely no evidence that backs that up. After Vasa sank, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it was a total loss. People raised sunken ships. There were well-known techniques for doing that. And when the ship landed on the bottom, it landed heeled to port. So the first task was to get the ship upright again. And Bulmer succeeded in doing that almost immediately. And then he set about trying to raise the ship. Unfortunately, it had been embedded in the mud of the bottom, that the force needed to lift it was much more than the weight of the ship. There were attempts to raise the ship all through the fall of 1628, the spring and summer of 1629, without success, before people really gave up. It was the site of a lot of activity over the next 35 years or so, trying to salvage originally the ship and then eventually recovering most of the guns. But after about the 1680s, people seem to have mostly left the site alone. It wasn't until the 1950s that someone came along who had a vision of what Vasa could become. That it wasn't just a matter of salvaging the guns, or as people did in the 1920s, blowing up old shipwrecks to salvage the timber to use to make furniture. But in the 1950s, a civilian engineer who worked for the Navy named Anders Franzén became interested in the history of the Navy. And one of the wrecks that he was looking for was Vasa. And what's interesting is for the first 2 years of his search, he didn't find it because he was looking in the wrong place. He was looking in the right stretch of the harbor, but on the wrong side, partly because it's ironic to say, he made the mistake of talking to a professor of history to find out where the ship had sunk. As he said himself, for those first 2 years, what he mostly found were stolen bicycles, abandoned shopping carts, and dead cats. In the summer of 1956, he started looking in the right place. There had been a plan to build a bridge over the harbor, and so there was a big project of sounding the harbor bottom that revealed there was a big lump in the bottom, about 50 meters long and 10 meters wide, and he was told, oh, that's just blasting rubble. And in fact, when Vasa was found, the whole upper deck was covered with blasting rubble. But Per Edvin Felting said, no, I don't think that's blasting rubble. And so Franzén and Felting together began dragging the harbor bottom. And on the 25th of August, 1956, their drag encountered a big object. Franzén put a coring device that he had developed that took a sample of it, discovered it was black oak. So to make sure it wasn't just one timber, they moved over about 20 meters, got another plug of black oak. So now that indicated there was a big, old, waterlogged wooden object lying on the bottom. A few weeks later, a diving vessel visited the site. They went down to the bottom. Felting walked towards where the obstruction was until he ran into a vertical wooden wall. And there's a square opening, and he moved along, and oh, here's another square opening. And then he started climbing up the side on the planks that stuck out and said, there's a second row of square openings. So that was when they knew they had found Vasa. Once the wreck had been relocated, the big question is, what do we do now? The vision that Anders Franzén had was, let's recover the entire ship and make it the centerpiece of a museum that would tell the story of Sweden and its great power period. So the very first phase was an investigation of how much ship is there and what kind of condition is it in, and is it possible or even practical. And the method they chose was exactly the same method that Ian Bulmer had attempted in the fall of 1628. And they succeeded in a series of 18 lifts, moved the ship into shallower water, and they spent a year and a half there closing in all of the openings in the hull. They rebuilt the collapsed stern, put covers over all the gun ports, and then in April of 1961, they winched the vessel to the surface. And once the upper edge of the hull was clear of the water all the way around, they put 3 gigantic pumps into the ship and pumped the water out until the ship floated again. And so Vasa, after 333 years, became the oldest ship ever successfully refloated. And it floated on its own keel, so it could be placed on a concrete pontoon. And in fact, the ship still stands on that pontoon, and we're inside it right now. The ceiling of this room is the deck of the pontoon, and this was the concrete box that was used to move Vasa around after it was lifted. Once the ship was raised, the next question was, how can it be preserved? Normally, you would submerge an object in a tank of this material and gradually increase the concentration so that it would saturate the object. But Vasa is too big to fit in a tank. And so instead, they decided to spray the ship. They also wanted the ship to be on display to the public because they needed some income. So Vasa became, from November of the year in which it was raised, a tourist attraction who would go into the hall where it was being preserved, The spray would be turned off while people could look at the ship from a viewing gallery, and then they would leave and the spray would be turned back on again. And then there was the discussion of how long do we have to spray it for? And there really wasn't any agreement about how long is long enough because no one had ever done this before. And so in 1979, the spraying stopped, and that was followed by a 10-year process of controlled drying. Nowadays, we tend to say we probably would have liked them to spray the ship for another 10 years. The conservation is never finished. What the ship needed 60 years ago when it was raised was one thing, but it needs constant attention to maintain it. One day, far in the future, Vasa will be nothing but dust. We cannot prevent that process. Our task is to slow that process as much as possible. But the time scale we're thinking in is centuries. And so major things that we've addressed in the last 20 years, say, have included establishing a stable climate around the ship. The next project that we're working on now is the overall structural stability of the hull. Those heavily built decks that are the reason the ship sank are also a threat to the ship's long-term survival. So we have to develop a support structure that carries the deck weight effectively and preserves the shape and structure of the ship. Vasa is not just a display case, it's a very active and dynamic research environment. A ship doesn't just represent the maritime part of society. It can tell us about forestry, it can tell us about the environment, it can tell us about the climate of that period. And so we have a research program that is very wide-ranging that tries to look at Vasa in the broadest possible context, to let it tell us everything it can tell us about the people of Sweden and Northern Europe 400 years ago. A current research project we're doing is looking at all the clothing on board the ship. These boxes on the table here are fragments of cloth that were found on the ship. This one should be a good example. That's the back of a jacket. There's enough of that left there for us to tell you how tall that guy was. But some of that research is very detail-focused, looking at this cloth. We're doing that under the microscope. Some of it's on a much larger scale, looking in archives for information about where they purchased things. And sometimes those projects are experimental. We want to understand how things were done. One of the most entertaining of those projects that we've done was to try to understand how you would use Vasa as a warship. How did they think they were going to use Vasa? Which ultimately leads to the question of why did they build that ship? Why did they build Vasa instead of a different kind of ship? Why did they choose that armament? What's the capability of Vasa in the tactical and strategic environment of the period?
The story of the Vasa is about more than just a warship. It is a story of the people who built her, the era she was born into, and the enduring legacy she leaves behind. And perhaps most importantly, the challenges of preserving her for future generations.